on some nights in war. Survival depends less on orders from headquarters and more on what exhausted men can build before sunrise. In October 1942, American PT boats in the waters around Guadalcanal were being outmatched by an enemy they should have been able to destroy. Their torpedoes ran too deep. Their machine guns bounced off armor. Their patrols were becoming death traps. Then one officer looked across a graveyard of wrecked fighter planes and saw a weapon no Navy manual had ever told him to use. By the next night, a crashed aircraft cannon was bolted to the deck of a wooden torpedo boat, and the balance of the fight began to change. Lieutenant Robert Lynch was 26 years old, commanding PT-48 in the black waters off Cape Esperance. He had already completed 14 night patrols and had nothing to show for them in confirmed kills. That was not because he lacked courage. It was because the math of the battlefield was broken. Japanese Daihatsu barges were slipping through the darkness carrying troops, ammunition and food to reinforce Guadalcanal. Each one could haul dozens of soldiers or tons of cargo. Each one sat shallow in the water. And that single detail made American torpedoes almost useless. The Mark 8 torpedoes carried by PT boats were deadly weapons on paper, but their shallowest setting was still too deep. Against those barges, they passed underneath without hitting a thing. That failure had consequences. By mid-October 1942, Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 had already lost 6 boats around Guadalcanal. 17 sailors were dead. The routine had become grimly familiar. Radar or lookouts would detect a Japanese barge convoy. A PT boat would close the distance and launch torpedoes. The torpedoes would miss because the barges drew too little water. The Japanese would open fire. The PT boats would either retreat damaged or burn. Every patrol was a gamble. Every miss gave the enemy one more chance to unload men and supplies where American forces could least afford it. The .50 caliber Brownings mounted on PT-48 were fearsome against ordinary wooden craft. They could spit out a storm of bullets that ripped open unarmored targets. But Daihatsu barges were not ordinary riverboats. They carried steel plate armor that could stop rifle-caliber fire and shrug off much of what the PT boats could throw at them. When American gunners opened up, the tracers looked dramatic in the night, but the rounds sparked against steel and did little real damage. It was noise, fury, and frustration. Meanwhile, the Japanese kept moving. Their nighttime supply effort down the Solomon Islands chain had already earned an American nickname, the Tokyo Express. Destroyers and cruisers had done much of that work early on, racing down under cover of darkness. But when American air power from Henderson Field made destroyer runs too costly, the Japanese adapted. They switched to barges. Slower, yes. Smaller, yes. But also harder to spot, harder to hit, and almost perfectly suited to the shallow, dangerous coastal waters where PT boats were operating. The enemy had found a loophole in American firepower. The men at Tulagi knew something had to change. Crews began improvising. Some boats mounted Army 37mm anti-tank guns on the bow. Those guns were stripped down, their wheels removed, their carriages lashed onto planks. In theory, the idea made sense. In practice, it was brutal. One round fired, then a slow manual reload while enemy machine guns stitched the... Kennedy's PT-109 experimented with that setup for a time. It was better than having nothing, but it was not the answer. Not for the scale of the problem. Japanese barges were coming through in groups night after night. A one-shot weapon would never be enough. The real issue was volume. A single Daihatsu barge could carry around 60 armed troops or several tons of vital supplies. Japanese forces were pushing 20, sometimes 30 barges per night through the waters near Guadalcanal. To make any real difference, PT boats had to do more than scare them. They had to stop them in numbers. They needed a gun that could fire fast, hit hard, and keep shooting. And that gun was sitting, unwanted, in the wreckage on Henderson Field. Henderson Field itself looked like a battlefield inside a battlefield. Captured by U.S. Marines in August, it had become a vital American lifeline and a constant target. Japanese bombing and shelling came so often that wrecked aircraft littered the area. Bent propellers, shattered wings, torn fuselages, burned out engines. Pieces of war lay everywhere. Among the wrecks were damaged Bell P-39 Airacobras. The Airacobra was an unusual fighter. Its engine sat behind the pilot, with a drive shaft running forward beneath the cockpit. That odd arrangement left room in the nose for something extraordinary, a 37mm automatic cannon firing through the propeller hub. That cannon changed everything. The Oldsmobile-built M4 37mm cannon was designed to hit harder than a machine gun ever could. It fed from a 30-round horseshoe magazine. It could fire at roughly 150 rounds per M in mint. Its shells included high explosive and armor-piercing types. Against thin armor, aircraft structures, light vehicles, or boats, it was devastating. Most of the wrecked P-39s at Henderson were beyond saving as airplanes. But many of their cannons were intact. The airframes were dead. The guns were still alive. On the morning of the 20th of October, Lynch walked through that aircraft graveyard and saw possibility. Mechanics had already scavenged instruments, radios, cables, and salvageable engine parts from many of the wrecks, but the cannons remained. Nobody had an official plan to mount aircraft weapons on naval patrol boats. No manual described it. No supply officer had signed off. No doctrine covered it. But doctrine was not sinking barges. Lynch was staring at a weapon that might. He took the idea to Commander Alan Calvert of Squadron 3. This was not the kind of request that passed through neat channels with proper forms and stamped approvals. This was frontline adaptation. If they wanted a cannon on a PT boat, they had to strip it from wrecked aircraft, invent a mount, haul it to the water, and bolt it down before the next night's patrol. There was no time for elegance, only urgency. The cannon itself was not light. A full M4 assembly with recoil components and feed system weighed hundreds of pounds. PT-48 was an 80-foot wooden Elco boat, fast and agile, but not built to carry random aircraft weapons on improvised mounts. The deck had structure enough for its original armament, yet nobody had ever calculated what would happen when a heavy automatic cannon started hammering away from the bow. Would the mount hold? Would the deck crack? Would recoil tear loose the fittings? There was only one way to find out. At Henderson Field, Lynch's crew found Technical Sergeant James Coogan, an aircraft armorer who understood the P-39 better than almost anyone around. He knew the cannon installation, the bolts, the recoil lines, the feed system. He also understood that this was madness in the best possible wartime sense. He climbed into wrecked Airacobras with wrenches and torches and began showing the sailors how to free the guns. The work was hard, filthy, and slow. Damaged metal had twisted around mounting points, bolts had seized, hydraulic lines had congealed in tropical heat. Sometimes they lacked the exact tools and simply made do. Gasoline became penetrating fluid. Improvisation became procedure. They worked aircraft by aircraft. Not every cannon was usable. Some recoil cylinders were cracked. Some feed mechanisms were bent. Some parts had taken unseen damage in crashes. But usable guns began to accumulate on the coral beside the runway. The next problem was how to mount one. At Henderson's machine shop, Chief Machinist Mate Donald Frey sketched a solution fast because he had to. There would be no polished engineering package, no factory blueprint, no perfect machining. He designed a crude pedestal from scrap steel, salvaged aircraft landing gear, pipe, and plate. It needed to anchor through the deck, absorb recoil, and still allow the gun to traverse. The welding was ugly. The tolerances were not beautiful. But ugly equipment that works in combat is better than perfect equipment that exists only on paper. By late that night, a truck carried the cannon and mount toward the water. From there it crossed to Tulagi. PT-48 waited in darkness while men measured the deck, drilled through plywood and oak framing, and wrestled the pedestal into place. Each hole took time. Everything took longer by hand. But sometime in the early hours of the 21st of October, the impossible had become real. PT-48 now carried a salvaged P-39 aircraft cannon on its bow. There had been no range test, no structural test, no training cycle. The crew knew almost nothing about how the weapon would behave in combat. The ammunition had to be stacked right on deck in loaded magazines because the boat had no proper storage system for aircraft feed drums. Gunners made second-class Harold Mitchell volunteered to fire it. He had experience with .50 cals, not nose cannons ripped from fighter wrecks. But in war, qualified sometimes simply means willing. That night, PT-48 put to sea with the rest of the patrol force. The sky was dark, overcast, and moonless. The sea was relatively calm. PT-48 ran quietly, using reduced power to limit wake and engine noise. The cannon pointed forward over the bow, and Mitchell sat behind it with magazines close at hand. Every man aboard knew they were carrying something unproven. Some probably wondered whether it would jam, shatter the mount, or throw the boat off balance. Others may have been too tired to care. What mattered was that they had one new chance to survive. Just before midnight, radar picked up surface contacts. 4 of them. Slow-moving, likely barges. Lynch turned to intercept. 48 closed the distance. Shapes emerged against the darker water. 4 Daihatsu barges in formation. Men were visible aboard. So were the weapons mounted on them. Under standard doctrine, a PT boat should have prepared torpedoes. But standard doctrine had already failed against this kind of target. Lynch pressed closer, not for torpedo range, but for gun range. At about 1,000 yards, the lead barge spotted the American boat. Its machine gun opened up. Tracer lines slashed orange across the darkness. Water kicked up short of PT-48. Lynch kept coming. Mitchell charged the cannon, a round chambered, then he fired. The sound was nothing like the Brownings. The 37mm roared. The muzzle flash lit the bow in a burst of white fire. The recoil drove the weapon hard against its mount. Men waited for something to break. Nothing did. The gun kept cycling. Shells slammed into the lead barge. High explosive rounds tore through the armor that had shrugged off machine gun fire. One shell burst inside, then another. Flames erupted from the center of the craft. Troops leapt overboard. The barge lurched forward, burning, then sagged and died. In seconds, the experiment had already justified itself. Mitchell stripped off the empty magazine and rammed on another. Reloading took precious seconds, but it worked. The second barge tried to turn away. PT-48 pursued. This time, the cannon opened up again at closer range. Shell after shell found the target. Then the barge detonated in a violent explosion, likely ammunition cooking off inside. It did not merely burn, it came apart. The surviving barges split up. One ran north, one turned south. PT-48 chased the southern target. By now, the improvised mount was heating, binding, and fighting Mitchell's attempts to track the moving craft. Enemy rounds snapped into the bow area. One punched through the deck near the gunner's position. Still, he stayed on the trigger. The shells walked up the barge from stern to bow. Its engine failed. Men abandoned ship. It did not fully sink in that moment, but it was finished as a fighting transport. When PT-48 broke contact, the result was astonishing. 3 magazines fired, 90 rounds expended, 2 barges destroyed, 1 disabled, no American casualties. The gun had not jammed, the mount had not torn free, the deck had held. The bow cannon worked not in theory, not in the test report, but in combat. Word spread fast. By early morning, other PT boat commanders wanted the same weapon. Henderson Field became a salvage yard with a purpose. Crews now knew what to remove first, what to cut, which parts were likely to be damaged, and how to inspect them. Cannon extraction became faster with practice. Mount construction also improved. Frey studied the wear on PT-48's pedestal and began refining the design. Better bearing surfaces, better fit, less wobble. Bronze bushings scavenged from other aircraft parts helped smooth the traverse. The first mount had been a desperate rush job. The next ones were still improvised, but smarter. Soon more PT boats in Squadron 3 were carrying 37mm cannons. More patrols went out, more barges were found, more of them were wrecked before they could unload supplies onto the coast. The results were not isolated luck. Patrol after patrol showed the same thing. A PT boat armed with a fast-firing 37mm automatic cannon could destroy barges far more reliably than a PT boat relying on torpedoes alone. The tactical shift was immediate. PT boats no longer had to hang back and hope a torpedo might somehow hit a shallow draft target. They could close in and fight directly. That was dangerous, yes. Japanese return fire was still real. But the Americans finally had a weapon suited to the job. A gun that could tear through armor plate, rip into troop compartments, ignite fuel, smash engines, and disable multiple targets in a single short engagement. The Japanese noticed too. Intercepted messages began describing American PT boats armed with heavier guns and explosive shells. The psychological effect mattered. For weeks, barge crews had been operating in an environment where PT boats were more nuisance than executioner. Now, the same dark silhouettes coming at them across black water could suddenly turn a barge into a torch in seconds. Success created new problems. Ammunition demand rose quickly. Air Force armorers had to load magazines constantly, 1 round at a time. Aircraft cannons had never been intended to supply a sustained naval anti-barge campaign. Salt water and humidity also attacked the guns. The M4 had been designed for aircraft, not for repeated exposure to sea spray, tropical heat, and coral dust aboard small boats operating from rough forward bases. Maintenance became almost as important as marksmanship. That is where men like Coogan proved essential. He moved into the PT boat world and began training gunners and mechanics to strip, clean, repair, and reassemble the cannons with limited tools and no luxury. Hydraulic seals failed. Feed systems wore down, corrosion started everywhere. Yet the guns kept operating because crews learned them by touch, by necessity, by repetition. Higher headquarters could not ignore the combat reports. The numbers spoke too clearly. Patrols with 37mm carrying PT boats were producing better results and taking fewer losses. A field improvisation born in the wreckage of Henderson Field had become one of the most successful weapons adaptations in the South Pacific. Eventually, formal reports went up the chain requesting approval, standard mounts, proper supply support, and official adoption. In a slower war, bureaucracy might have crushed the idea. It might have been rejected as unsafe, non-standard, or unauthorized. Instead, combat performance forced the issue. The Navy's Bureau of Ordnance reviewed the evidence and approved standardized pedestal mounts for PT boats. That decision mattered. But it also arrived only after the frontline crews had already proven the concept with welds, salvage, and risk. Even then, supply remained difficult. Henderson Field could yield only so many usable cannons because there were only so many wrecked Airacobras to strip. Fresh guns eventually had to come from the larger logistics network farther south. New assemblies, still packed in preservative, were diverted into PT boat service. With those new weapons and improved mounts, later squadrons could install the 37mm without the same desperate scavenger hunt that had defined the first conversions. By early 1943, the 37mm cannon was spreading through the PT boat force in the Solomon Islands. Entire squadrons were now operating with this new capability. The effect on Japanese movement was severe. Barges became vulnerable in the very environment where they had once seemed safe. Convoys that previously slipped through began disappearing in fire and smoke. Engines were smashed. Ammunition cargoes detonated. Troops who expected a nighttime run to shore found themselves leaping into black water under shell fire instead. PT boat doctrine evolved around the gun. Boats began operating in coordinated pairs more often. One would engage with the 37mm while the other laid down suppressive fire with machine guns or stood ready in case larger enemy vessels appeared. Crews learned to aim at fuel tanks, engines, spaces, and troop-packed sections for maximum effect. They learned how many shells it generally took to disable or destroy a barge. They learned how to reload fast under stress. Combat turned improvisation into method. The enemy adapted as well. Japanese commanders increasingly assigned escorts to barge movements. Destroyers and other armed vessels sometimes accompanied the convoys, trying to push PT boats back with heavier guns. The 37mm was deadly against barges and light craft, but it was no answer to a destroyer's armor and firepower. That reality created another stage in the PT boat arms race. Crews wanted more guns, heavier guns, and better combinations of weapons. Over time, PT boats became less like pure torpedo craft and more like compact, heavily armed night gunboats. Even so, the significance of the first cannon remained. It solved the immediate problem that had been costing lives in late 1942. As the war expanded into New Guinea and later back into the Philippines, the 37mm cannon went with it. What had been pioneered in the Solomons became official equipment. In New Guinea, where Japanese forces also relied heavily on barges to move along coastlines and between isolated positions, the gun proved its worth again. Narrow waters, jungle-lined shores, and nighttime supply runs created exactly the kind of environment where PT boats could exploit speed and hard-hitting direct fire. The weapon itself also evolved. Later variants and better naval installations offered more stability, range, and purpose-built mounting solutions. But those improvements do not erase where the idea came from. The breakthrough was not born in a design office. It was born in the frustration of combat, in the recognition that the current tools were failing, and in the willingness of frontline men to solve the problem without waiting for perfect permission. That may be the most important part of this story. War is often remembered through grand strategy, famous admirals and massive battleships. But sometimes the outcome of an entire tactical problem turns on a handful of mechanics with torches beside wrecked airplanes. It turns on a machinist sketching a pedestal mount on scrap metal. It turns on a gunner willing to fire an untested cannon from the bow of a wooden boat in the middle of the night. It turns on a commander willing to say yes before the paperwork exists. Lieutenant Lynch was one of those men. So were Coogan, Frey, Mitchell, and the crews who kept making the system work. They were not inventing for prestige. They were trying to stop being helpless against targets they could see but could not kill. Their solution saved boats, reduced casualties, and multiplied the damage PT units could inflict on enemy supply lines. Post-war analysis would confirm what the men on the water already knew. PT boats armed with 37mm cannons were dramatically more effective than those without them. Their kill rates increased, their losses fell. The statistics reflected a hard battlefield truth. Once the PT boats had a weapon matched to the shallow draft barge threat, they stopped fighting the wrong war and started winning the right one. And the scale of that mattered. Destroying barges was not glamorous in the way sinking a cruiser would be. But barges carried troops. Barges carried ammunition. Barges carried rice, fuel, mortar rounds, machine gun belts, and the everyday cargo that keeps an army alive. Every barge destroyed offshore meant soldiers on land receiving less. Fewer reinforcements, fewer supplies, more delay, more pressure. In campaign warfare, logistics decides how long armies can keep fighting. The 37mm cannon helped PT boats attack logistics where it was weakest. By the last stages of the war, PT boats were no longer the same lightly armed craft they had been at the beginning. Standardized gun packages, heavier forward firepower, and improved tactical roles had transformed them. The boats still carried the legend of speed and night attacks, but they now hit harder and survived better because of innovations like the 37mm conversion. After the war, many of the men involved returned quietly to civilian life. Lynch did not become a household name for this innovation. Frey did not receive broad recognition for his mount design. Coogan's maintenance work never turned into a famous chapter in popular history. Mitchell, who sat behind that cannon on the first night, did not become a legend on posters. Yet their combined work shaped a weapon system that spread through the PT boat service and left a measurable mark on the Pacific War. Only a small number of World War II PT boats survive today. Some preserved examples still display 37mm mounts, physical reminders of the moment when desperation turned into battlefield adaptation. If you stand in front of one now, the metal and wood looks still, almost harmless. But in 1942, on black water off Guadalcanal, that gun represented a sudden reversal of fortune. It meant PT crews no longer had to watch enemy barges keep coming while their own weapons failed them. It meant the next contact could end differently. And that is why this story matters, because it is not only about a gun. It is about a pattern repeated across history. When institutions are too slow and the danger is too close, survival often depends on people at the edge of the fight being clever enough to improvise. The cannon on PT-48 was not born from comfort. It was born from need. The idea worked because the problem was real. The men understood it, and they acted before waiting for someone far away to tell them it was allowed. One night, American sailors looked at wrecked fighter planes and saw spare parts. Then they looked again and saw a weapon. And once they mounted that weapon on a PT boat, Japanese barges crossing the Solomons were no longer passing through untouched. They were entering a killing zone built from scrap steel, borrowed courage, and frontline ingenuity.